All right, so I'm really glad to be talking to the DDI today because I think this is the first audience I've actually had that is probably equally invested in some of the stuff that I'll be talking about, albeit coming from different places, but also we have a lot of complementarity. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And I'm going to try to keep my comments brief. So I'm a political scientist, as Alberto said. But for this talk, and really in my thinking about technology and society, my focus has been outside of my own discipline for a number of reasons we can talk about. But as Alberto said, the talk today is based on a book that was published last year by MIT Press. And in writing it, I did write it for not only a general audience, but for also people outside of my own discipline, as a way to bridge build and also to jumpstart conversations around emerging tech, around AI, and around the data requirements in particular for AI systems. And so, part of why I wrote this book was to really show why the lens of human rights really matters, and also how a political scientist thinking about these issues through the human rights lens can really hopefully shift our perspective on thinking about how individuals and collectives in society can really manage some of the changes due to AI and due to datafication. So this is kind of it was a book that actually came about. I got the inspiration right before the pandemic. And so I also felt like I got a front seat to observing how digitization really ends up changing a lot of the ways that people do things, did things in particular, but also do things now as a consequence. I ended up reading and writing a lot and alternately feeling senses of dread and excitement because I could see like there were a lot of things that people hadn't picked up on because they weren't thinking about this from an explicitly political lens, and especially a lens of human rights, even though a lot of people were also saying emerging technologies are going to fundamentally change the human experience. So where was the human rights and all of that? That's usually when we think about changes to human life, human rights, at least from my perspective, is one of the key things we need to think through. So what I'm going to do today in the short time we have together is talk through some key concepts I talk about in the book and really provide a rationale for why we need a human right to data literacy. I think some of you were thinking about this in terms of data fluency, so actually want to see where the interface there is. But also I'll try to leave some time to end with thinking about how political science questions and tools can help us think about the consequences of data and datafication. So I like to start by talking about the intersection of Shaquille O'Neal, Amazon.com, and the TV show Shark Tank, because I think this is one of those things that, while on the surface don't seem connected, they are because they're all connected through the Ring doorbell as a product. So Amazon owns Ring Company. The product was actually shown initially on Shark Tank and wasn't doing that well until a number of things changed, including Shaquille O'Neal signing on as the pitchman for the Ring Company. And so I'm sure many of you today have this device or know someone who has this device or have walked by. We have all walked by many of these devices. So we're familiar with what they are. And sales have surged since the pandemic. They've surged during the pandemic. And these, like other video doorbells like the Nest or the Arlo, they're really designed to give people a sense of ability to do things when they're not at home. Right, to monitor the spaces around these devices, to answer the door. And so part of what is enticing about the Ring suite of products is that you can link them all together, but also create audio and visual recordings of what's going on where you put them, and often that's in front of or on your private property. So what does this have to do with human rights, right? Why is a smart doorbell the way I like to start this talk? Well, I think it's illustrative of how everyday objects are really raising important questions for the human experience, and therefore I would argue human rights. So as these devices become more pervasive in our lives, and they're very data intensive and using AI systems to run them and make them effective, we're really relying on massive pools of data about people, data taken from people in order to work. And the consequence of that is actually more and more data about our mundane everyday activities is feeding into this system. So data is being taken from us. These data are about us, and often in the most unexpected and mundane ways, which I'll return to later. So the Ring's audio and visual detection and recording abilities really change the terms of who can survey. I think most of us probably are used to the idea that states survey public spaces for safety concerns, maybe private, people who own private buildings have CCTV as well. But now we're talking about something that, is really on homes, facing streets, and streets are very much public venues, and it's on uh, private property, and it's becoming more ubiquitous. And the surveillance isn't being done by someone who owns like a large space where the public might congregate. It's really being done at the household level. So that's a big change. And the types of data being collected. So it's our voices, it's our gait in the video data, it's our faces, it's features about us. These are all being captured for analysis or simply just to have for homeowners who are, especially those who are paying for subscriptions. But also it's been known that and Ring Company has gotten in some trouble for actually having a backdoor for law enforcement to access Ring data without the Ring device owner's consent or even knowledge. There have also been cases where these devices have been hijacked, right? The two-way microphones have been hacked into. Unsuspecting children and seniors and other people have had mysterious voices talking to them and scaring them and really stalking these people through their own devices. So in other words, flipping the surveillance back onto those who are doing that surveillance in their homes. And I think the last part is we as people passing on the sidewalk or driving our vehicles, going about our everyday lives, we're not really thinking about the fact that these devices are really everywhere, but they are. And, we're not consenting to that kind of activity being monitored, and neither are the doorbell owners consenting to having data that their devices are collecting. They're not consenting to some of the uses that are being leveraged as a result of the data that those devices collect. So, to bring up the Ring, it's just one of many of these so-called smart objects that are recording and sharing data about us with various entities, be they corporate or government. And these entities have an interest in collecting data from people. So the two questions I like to wrap my talk around today are, first, to what extent are human activities and by extension, human existence becoming data? And second, how are rights as human beings being tested and perhaps violated in a social context in which Ring and other types of similar devices are ubiquitous in our pockets, in our wrists, in our bags, and adorning the fronts of our homes. So I organized the talk in 5 takeaways, I think, that are key for understanding the main points of the book. So these days we hear a lot about data taken from people. So, we're often confronted with news about how companies are using data in ways that people don't expect. Perhaps we find that troubling. We, last year found out that, and we're finding out more and more how we are, many of us are free fodder for generative AI systems like ChatGPT, for example. And so there's a sense that maybe we can't help but be part of that system, that we're falling victim to these processes that are sort of beyond us. And I think that also speaks to how our lives are organized and how we conduct our day-to-day activities. Because many of us are very dependent on smartphones, myself included, we depend on the internet to do our work, right? We are connected. And so we engage with digital technologies in these ways, but also in ways that we don't really think about, or many people don't think about. So tapping into public transit or patronizing stores with loyalty points. Some of these stores even have facial recognition technology, depending on where you are, or, with Ring doorbells on the streets that we're walking on and transiting through. And so, I don't need to tell this group here that our lives are datafied, right? In the sense that our behaviors that might be revealing of our innermost thoughts and choices, all these personal activities that we engage in are actually becoming digital data. And so sometimes people talk about this in terms of data subjects, right? We are data subjects. And, the fact is data are being taken from us, but we have had to date very little to say about under what conditions this happens or that it happens at all. And so we have very little choice but to be subjected to data collection. So this book is actually about why it's important to rethink that relationship and to understand that we are actually data stakeholders. And this is why, and I'll, hopefully by the end of the talk, it'll be clear why human rights really matter in this process. But we need to understand the importance of being a data source, that it's actually a position of extreme importance in the process of creating data. And even in a sea of data sources, we are not necessarily destined to lose to the great data collectors that we know as Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Meta, and others. Okay? So to be a stakeholder, this really means making your voice heard. And the challenge is clear, right? There are billions of data sources out there, and there are very few data collectors. But I think one of the problems is the way we talk about data. And that is that we disconnect data from people from the humans that create them, right? So we're told that data are not something intrinsically human. In fact, we're even in the best case scenario, data are seen as a commodity of value to be traded and sold like oil, right? It's not thought about as part of human activity or part of a human life. In the worst case scenarios, we're often told that data are dust or detritus or exhaust. In other words, byproducts of a process that is beyond us. And I also think, there's this pervasive idea that if we're not paying, then we're the product. And that is something we should accept about modern commerce or the data age. And I think we need to reimagine the world, to be thinking about data not as part of a market relationship, which is the dominant way to think about data, but actually to think of it as part and parcel with human life. And if we do that, then we can use the globally endorsed framework of human rights to help us think through what it means to be a data stakeholder. And the difference between data stakeholdership and being a data subject, I hope, is clear to folks here. But it really is about both being invested in the process, knowing that we actually have skin in the game. It's not inevitable, but also that we're entitled to speak up and to act against it, right? The process is political and social. And so rather than sitting back and being subject to data collector policies about how they make, store, and analyze data, we actually have an ability through human rights to talk about a future where data processes are embedded in human rights values. Okay, so that's the first lesson that or takeaway I want to talk about. Now, there are problems with that. Okay, so it sounds great, but the problem is that data are sticky. And so this is something that I really try to develop in the book, and talk about how data are literally sticky like gum on the bottom of your shoe. All of us have had this wonderful experience of not knowing we've stepped on gum till we go somewhere where we take off our shoes, and it's very hard to take off that gum, right? So, I think the process of data generation and collection is quite similar, is that we don't really know that it's happened. And once it's happened, it's quite difficult to be rid of the data that are created about our behaviors. Now, the difference in the analogy, of course, is that we often don't even know that the data are there, unlike the gum on our shoe, right? So digital data in particular, are very valuable because they're easy to copy and transfer. It makes passing information in society quite a lot more seamless than other analog ways. And that, we can think about how those contribute to stickiness, but in the book, I actually argue that we should actually be thinking about data about people as sticky in 4 other ways. So the first I've already talked about is that it's mundane stuff that's being recorded. So most of the stuff that forms these giant databases about people are not remarkable things. They're things you do every day, and therefore you cannot help but do them. And in some cases, it's data about your physical being. It's data about the way you walk, your heartbeats, your face. I mean, you could change your face, but most people don't want to do that, right? So it's stuff you can't help. And I think, people have talked about this as privacy, or, I would think of it as more boring and unremarkable data. And that's why I think about it in terms of mundaneness in the book. Stuff you can't help but do, and is often necessary in our everyday existence. The second reason data are sticky is because they're linked, right? So data are used and traded in all sorts of transactions between entities, whether they're public or private, There are lots of great uses for linking data together. And so this is just pointing out that the likelihood of data sticking in just one place is very unlikely. And the fact is we might not know where the data go once they're created. And this speaks to the third reason why data are sticky, which is that they're effectively forever once created. We don't have an effective way to track them. It would be a huge investment of resources to figure this out, at least at this point, given how much data there are about all of us. And it's also very hard to verify deletion of data, especially when data are collected, which is the sort of the last point about data stickiness. Data are co-created. So there are sort of 2 points wrapped up in this idea of co-creation. One is that it goes back to this idea of being a data source. So in order to create data about people, you need 2 entities. You need a data source who's doing the things, and you need a data collector who's interested in actually taking the things that the data source is doing and making them into data, to systematically record those data, right? To record activity as data. And so without either party, you don't have data. You just have activity, right? But now that we have both, we need both the creator and the source, or the collector and the source. This is a co-creative process, right? Whether we like it or not. And so in terms of human rights, when we think about property rights in particular, to whom the data belongs is actually not the easiest problem to solve. Is it the data source's data because they are the ones doing the things that are making the data, and often the things can be very personal? Or is it the data collectors because they're the ones who've actually gone about and made the data? Okay, so that's really one of the sticklers for thinking about data in terms of human rights, is this co-creative aspect in terms of the actual making of data. But we also should be thinking about the co-creativeness of data in terms of the collective implications. So we all experience data collection individually through our devices, through our activities. But the data that are out there are also often collective. Like think about, posts of group photos, for example, on social media. They're inherently collective. But also the value of collecting data on individual behaviors or individual choices is really important only in the collective. If you were only collecting data about one person, it's not that valuable, because the whole point for a lot of the algorithmic predictions we're getting is that we are looking for people, quote, like you, right? We're trying to create more, or algorithms are trying to create more categories of people, different types of collectives than might exist consciously in human life, in human society. And so even though data are coming from individuals, the implications of the inferences being made are collective. And so we have to think about how when data about us are created, they're not being created in isolation, and they have both collective and individual implications. So let's turn a little bit to how human rights can help. Now, there are a lot of different definitions about human rights out there, a lot of different ways to think about this. I'm actually teaching a course on human rights again this semester, and so I'm really thinking about how to explain it to people who are coming into it for the first time, and it's hard to boil it down, right? There are a lot of different ways to think about what human rights are. The political scientist Jack Donnelly, who's written one of the foremost texts on human rights, really says, human rights are about human potential. They're not about what we are today, but what we might become. And I think that's a really good way to think about the importance of human rights. And so just to think about institutionally, where we are in terms of human rights. So, after World War II, the United Nations, pledged that human rights would be one of the main pillars of the organization. And this led to a number of activities, including the writing and passing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So through this document, after it took years of negotiation between the state delegates that were there, and they came up with 30 articles. And these 30 articles they saw as the key to defining the new international human rights framework that came into existence as a result of the UDHR. So human rights are universal, unconditional, and interdependent. Okay, so you can't really pick and choose. You have to kind of accept human rights holistically. So some frequently cited examples might be the freedom of expression or freedom from torture, but there's also the right to education, the right to choose your marriage partner, the right to a fair trial. There's a whole bunch, and I'm sure if you think about it, the list would be pretty fairly obvious because of how much human rights have become part of our political systems. Now, it's also important to point out that this framework assigned the responsibility for human rights to states. So states are the ones who are supposed to protect and ensure human rights. Okay. And from a legal perspective, since the UDHR, there have been many regional human rights treaties that have been written. So in the Americas, we have the Inter-American, the equivalent, the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights. In Europe, there's the European Convention of Human Rights. And there are also 9 main human rights treaties in the UN system, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or the Convention Against Torture. So we've got a lot of different legal instruments out there. And it's a very robust system of law in thinking about what things are being protected. Now, I actually argue that in the book that this is great, we have all these laws, but we should actually be stepping back from that. Okay, so the focus in human rights often is what is the law or the right being violated, and how can we explain that? And I think it's actually important to pull back and say, what is the purpose of human rights to begin with? Okay, and so this is a graphic that sort of illustrates the vision that René Cassin, who was one of the founders of the UDHR, he pulled this together because they had 30 articles in the UDHR, and they were like, well, how do they cohere? And so his idea was they cohere like the entryway to a Greek temple. So you can see there's a roof. The roof is the collective enterprise of human rights. And there are 4 pillars, splitting the various articles in the UDHR into sort of logical categories that I think I would argue actually restrict the way we think about them, but nonetheless, they're very popular ways to think about human rights. And you've got, the stairs leading up to this temple. Now, I think this is a really nice summary of the law, or the declaration, which is not law in a binding sense, but it's a very nice summary of what's in the actual text of the UDHR. But I also want to point to the foundation of this temple. Right? The foundation points to 4 values of human rights. This is the rationale and the reasoning for why we made the UDHR, or why the founders created the UDHR. And I would say that these are the values that actually often are what's being tested when we think about how AI or how datafication has actually changed human existence. So, thinking about these values of dignity and equality, and in the book I call liberty autonomy, because autonomy is about agency as well. So it's not just being unencumbered, it's actually the capacity to act. That's what autonomy is really trying to capture. So I talk about dignity and autonomy and equality, and I've updated brotherhood to be community, because I think brotherhood's kind of a dated term. These 4 values are about, I think these are where a lot of our conversations are. So if we think about autonomy, I talked about as the capacity to act in the world. Dignity is about being treated as though you have worth as a human being, right? And to also, feel that you have this worth in terms of how you're treated. I think thinking about equality is how is everyone else being treated, and am I being treated in the same way in accordance to a common baseline? And this idea of community, I think, is super important because it is about the sociality of human life, right? That this is the collective part. We're not all just individual agents acting. There's a collective enterprise going on. And I don't think these values have actually changed in importance. Like I said, I think that's what we're arguing about a lot in terms of the debates about privacy, for example, or consent. I think, though, that, of course, the UDHR framers were really concerned with physical constraints and physical harm, right, in their time. That's all they knew, because that's all the world really was about. And now we do need to think about how the digital world has shifted some of those physical constraints and physical harms or threats, but also how the digital world creates new problems that are not separate from these physical problems. They're actually part of the same human life, right? And so we really need to think about how data has changed how we live our lives in a way that's continuous with our analog lives. And so I think this is really the foundation. We should be thinking about some of these questions using the human rights framework. Now, I spent some time in the book also thinking about the way that big tech fundamentally changes some of the ways that we experience our lives as well. So we're used to thinking about big tech, I think, in terms of how wealthy they are, how they skew the S&P, with their hugeness, what their earnings are, that sort of thing. They're incredibly historically wealthy entities. You know that. But money is also just one way to think about power. So we have to step back from that. And I think really think about what it is that a lot of these big tech companies are doing, and how the types of products they're creating, of course, are collecting data, but they're also infused in our lives in ways that I think other types of products have not historically been. And the way that their creations work allows them to govern in ways that I think we're used to thinking about how states do things, right? But actually, if we break down this definition, what is governing? Governing means creating order around shared expectations. And so what that actually entails often is setting rules and then finding ways to enforce those rules. That's governing. And so, governing is what we expect governments to do. But I think more and more, we actually should be thinking about how big tech governs, okay? And so they create and control the digital platforms, of course, and so they can govern through their platforms, determine the way we, for example, have social and political connections, right? So in the book, I talk about Meta's community standards and their oversight board and how they've used this institution that they've created to try to think about what's appropriate to say or not say on Instagram and Facebook. And they can do this because they reach roughly 3 to 4 billion people, depending on when you're counting. It's incredible in terms of what kind of effect they have. So 3 to 4 billion people is way more than any government can actually legitimately claim to govern, okay? And so we have to think about how an entity like Meta has the capacity to influence about half the world's population, and how that is much more than any government can actually legitimately claim to do. And as I said earlier, right now, human rights responsibility is falling on states. It's falling on governments, right, to be responsible for protecting and enforcing human rights. And so there's a real disconnect because big tech, they're businesses. Businesses under our current human rights framework are not responsible. They must respect human rights, but it's actually ultimately up to states to make sure that businesses respect human rights. Okay, so there's a real disconnect in the way that we think about human rights and how they work in the everyday versus how they might work in a legal framework. And, I think one of the things we have to think about is how big tech like Google or like Meta affects our ability to exercise our rights. So just thinking through in the Canadian context with the ongoing dispute over the Online News Act still going on, right? So at this point, and when I first started talking about this or giving this talk a few months ago, both Google and Meta were like, oh, we're refusing the Online News Act. Now Google has paid up, right? And Meta continues to dispute that they're actually covered by the Online News Act. Okay, and they've also scaled back their news sharing abilities on their platform. So this is an open debate and an open dispute, but the fact is many people get their information from Meta, from Google. And so if Google had decided not to come to an agreement with the Online News Act, we could have denied people access to information, which affects not only people's ability to have freedom of conscience and freedom of thought, but of course, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, our ability to learn, so the right to education. I could kind of go on about how this messes up how people experience their basic human rights. So the final thing I want to talk about in terms of takeaways from the book is data literacy as a human right. So I'm going to quickly go through this because I have another slide I want to talk about. So in the book, I talk about, given the fact that datafication is so has had so many consequences on human life and is also here to stay, we need to correspondingly think about how then we educate people to keep up with this fundamental change in our human experience. And so data literacy, I argue, should be part of the right to education and should become part of the program at the international level, at the national level, in communities, in terms of thinking about what it means to be literate, which is competence, right? To be competent and the ability to function in your daily life. So if you couldn't read and write, if you can't do basic math, it's really hard to do daily functions. And I think, and I think now it's high time to recognize that also not understanding how data work, how they're constructed, what assumptions are built into data sets, what kinds of biases we inevitably build into data. There are no perfect data, there are no unbiased data. These are things that many people don't think about. And I think it's really important. I wrote a piece in the Toronto Star recently with a couple of librarian colleagues about using libraries as data stewards, of rethinking how libraries should be funded, and really given that sort of latitude to help people not just to learn to read and to write, but also to read data, to understand how data are built. And there are a number of programs out there, including, I think, some of the ones that you guys have created here, that really speak to, it's not about being a data scientist, right? It's about being competent and understanding what goes into data, even if you don't use data for your job or livelihood. Very quickly, I want to talk about some of the political lenses or what's important about a political lens on thinking about issues of technology and data. And I think the two things that I really lead out of the book is really thinking about how to use some of the insights or the takeaways from this book to think about the possibility of collective action, because that's really what data stakeholdership is about. And so some of the things that come from my other work on civil society and on thinking about global advocacy is thinking about how NGOs or other civil organizations frame the ask. So the ask is often really important in terms of thinking about success at the global level, in terms of advocacy and the politics around social and political change. And so right now, I think the ask is unclear in terms of those of us who would be considered data stakeholders or data sources. So that's part of the issue. We can also think about, how there can be differential harms within and between societies. So of course, we can think about the difference between developing versus developed economies and how they use and think about emerging tech, but also thinking about a lot of the work on discrimination against, different racial groups, different ethnic groups, different genders. All of this really, really matters for thinking about how social action and how social change happens. I should also say here that the challenge to collective action right now, or thinking about classic ways of theorizing and conceptualizing collective action, is that the collectives are unclear. So as I said earlier, many collectives now are created by algorithms that don't exist in everyday life. And our experience of our lives online in particular are shaped by these collectives that we ourselves are not aware of, that we've been lumped into. So I think that is a big challenge for thinking about how people act, because usually when you think about social movements, people get together because they feel they have solidarity or they have common interests or values. And if you don't know who's in your collective, it's really hard to actually come to that kind of motivation. And I think the other thing that comes from some political science work, but also sociology, is thinking about why people don't act even when they seem to have an interest in acting. So why don't people resist injustice or inequity when the cards are stacked against them? And so this is really pulling on work by Stephen Lukes and John Gaventa in particular, thinking about this idea of the third face of power, how that creates a quiescence, a sort of acceptance of the status quo, even though you might be unhappy because you feel like you can't make change, right? You feel like you're stuck. But there are other ways that I think, thinking about big tech and how they talk about AI, how they frame AI, it does seem like it is very difficult to resist because it's inevitable, or it's already here, or AGI is going to make us all into paper clips, or whatever the sort of framing of the day is. And I think there's also some work in voting behavior that talks about why people vote the way they do, even if it might be working against their material interests. Voting is one of these things that is a continual source of fascination, and I think also puzzlement for many political scientists who study that area. So, this is, I think, sort of to frame the conclusion, treating data from people can be as simple as treating them as that, right? Which is that data are coming from people and therefore should be treated as though they come from people. And I think that's an important turn of mind that is not present in current policy debates. Data don't come from nowhere, right? They come from someone, and they're co-created, right? Data come from a co-creative process that is laden with not just economic concerns, but politics and social concerns and cultural concerns. And so if we don't recognize that the process of data collection and creation is overladen with power and that it is not just an economic function, I think this is why we have the current state of affairs that we have with AI. I mean, that's what I would argue. And so in that sense, privacy is not the only tool we have. I think right now a lot of people talk about privacy, but the problem with privacy is that the data have already been collected. To respect privacy, you're really trying to just promise that you will protect those data from incursion or from misuse, but the data already exists. So what if we think about it differently as data not having to exist at all? Certain types of data, certainly about our behaviors, doesn't have to exist. The other thing I think I hear a lot of is consent. So we are consenting, and I know, click consent is a common thing people criticize. But I also want to think about this as a social science researcher. So I've done qualitative research. I'm in the process of doing survey research. All of these processes involve human subjects, which means I have to think about what happens to my human subjects when they're in my study, right? When people become data for Wendy Wong, we have to think about whether they can consent appropriately, whether they can get out, whether the de-identification is sufficient, right? And so all of us as researchers who use human subjects, and I would say that's social sciences in particular, medical researchers, but it's not all researchers, and it's not all fields, right? We understand what it means to think about data coming from humans, I think more than most people. And I think that's an important insight in that there are already ways to govern and protect people in data sets. They're not perfect. There are always ways that are, lots of problematic things. But at the same time, forcing researchers like me to think about what happens to the data about people that I'm interested in is a really important exercise. And I think it should be one that goes hand in hand with thinking about, human rights, right? Human rights are not a silver bullet, but I do think if we're not thinking about autonomy and community or dignity and equality, we're not going to really be able to create a path where the human part of the data is really at the forefront of thinking about policy. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing from you.